Hello everybody, Heath the Vlogger Guy here. It is December 8th. It is time for the 8th reading in our Christmas stories. And if you're watching this video and you have not yet, why don't you hit that subscribe button. Also, ring that bell and that will notify you anytime I put out any kind of new content. And if you're liking what you're seeing, give me a thumbs up. Also, feel free to share this video so we can get it out to more eyes. Tonight I decided not to kick on the lights. We're just going to have the bass as the background. Sorry for that momentary of quietness. I had to get something to drink so my mouth wouldn't get dry. Tonight I'm going into my son's big book of Christmas stories. And tonight's story is going to be Mickey's Christmas Carol. It's a good classic story. Who doesn't like A Christmas Carol? Just kind of getting it so I don't have to try and guess if you guys are seeing the page. All right, so let's go ahead and get started here. It was snowing in London, England on Christmas Eve. Ebenezer Scrooge, the richest man in town, hurried towards his office. "Merry Christmas," someone shouted. "Bah humbug," Scrooge muttered. He didn't know why everyone had to be so cheerful at Christmas. When Scrooge reached the door to his office, he looked up at the sign. It read Scrooge and Marley, but Marley's name had been crossed out. He had been dead for 7 years. Scrooge and Jacob Marley had tricked people who didn't have much to give them money. They had gotten very rich and hadn't cared that they'd been unfair. Scrooge cracked it through, crackled as his thought of all the money. Bob Cratchit, Scrooge's clerk, was just about to throw a piece of coal into the stove when Scrooge walked in. "What are you doing?" Scrooge growled. "I was just thawing out the ink," Bob replied. He gave his boss a small but hopeful smile. Scrooge knocked the coal out of Bob's hand and scowled. "You used a piece last week. Get back to work," he said. Bob quickly turned back to his desk. After a few moments, Bob snuck a glance at his boss. Then he said, "Speaking of work, Mr. Scrooge, tomorrow is Christmas, and I was wondering if I might have the day off." Scrooge was silent for a long time. "Very well," he finally said, "but make sure you come in early the day after." Scrooge hung up his jacket and hat. Then he sat down at his desk and began to count his money. Money, 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 he growled. Suddenly the door burst open. A young man carrying a wreath walked in. "Merry Christmas," the man said. It was Scrooge's nephew, Fred. "Christmas," Scrooge scoffed. "Bah humbug." Fred walked up to Scrooge's desk and gave him the wreath. He thought the office could use some holiday cheer. "Uncle, I'm coming to invite you to Christmas dinner tomorrow," Fred said with a smile. Oh, Scrooge asked as he came out from behind his desk. And will there be plum pudding? And sugar cakes? And plum roast goose? Oh, yes, Fred replied. He nodded his head and smacked his lips. You know I can't eat that stuff. Now get out! Scrooge got up and opened the door. He hung the wreath over Fred's neck and pushed his nephew out into the cold. As Scrooge walked back to his desk, the door opened again. Fred smiled and hung the wreath on the inside of the doorknob, then closed the door. Later that night, Scrooge walked home. He had a strange feeling that he was being followed. When he reached the front door, he looked at the knocker, and it was a lion's head. But as Scrooge stared at it, it began to change. Before his eyes, suddenly Scrooge was looking at the face of his old partner, Jacob Marley. Ah! Scrooge yelled. Scrooge hurried inside and up to his bedroom. When he closed the door and climbed onto his chair, he heard the sound of clanking chains. He shivered, too afraid to move. Then the ghost appeared beside him. It was Jacob Marley. He was covered in heavy chains. Ebenezer, the ghost wailed as he rattled his chains. Do you know who I am? Scrooge peered at the ghost from under the top hat. When I was alive, I robbed the widows. I took money from the poor, Jacob said. You were a fine partner, Jacob, Scrooge said with a smile. No, Jacob replied. I was wrong. And now I have to carry these chains forever as punishment. The same thing will happen to you. Tonight you will be visited by 3 spirits. If you don't listen to them, your chains will be heavier than mine. Then Jacob's ghost disappeared. Scrooge was still shaking with fear as he got ready for bed. After checking the room for more ghosts, he climbed under his covers. Humbug, he muttered, then fell asleep. But it wasn't long before noise woke him up. Ding, ding, ding. His clock bell was ringing. Scrooge opened his eyes and found a little cricket in a top hat on his bed table. I am the ghost of Christmas past, the cricket said. We're going to visit your past tonight. The ghost went to the window and pushed it open. Just hold on, the ghost said as he hopped onto Scrooge's hand. Scrooge did as the cricket said. As they flew into the darkness, the city passed slowly beneath them as they flew high above the snow-covered rooftops. First stop Scrooge and the ghost of Christmas past made was to a little shop. A party was taking place inside. Scrooge looked through the window. It's old Fezziwiggles, he exclaimed. He saw his old boss and many of his dearest friends laughing and dancing inside. Then he saw Isabel, the girl he had once loved. She was dancing with a young man. It was him, back before he had become the greedy old man. As if reading Scrooge's mind, the ghost said, in 10 years' time, you learn to love something else much more. The spirit showed Scrooge another scene. Isabel and Scrooge were in his counting house. Ebenezer, Isabel said softly, have you made a decision about getting married? I have, Scrooge replied. The last payment on your cottage was late. Then he told her he was taking the cottage away. Isabel began to cry. As Scrooge watched, he shook his head. Remember, Scrooge, said the ghost, you made these memories. Scrooge found himself back in bed again. Then he heard a loud voice. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Scrooge looked up and saw a giant. The giant lifted him up and picked him up and carried him out into the night. He brought Scrooge to a shabby little house. Through the window, Scrooge saw Bob Cratchit and his family. They were having Christmas dinner. On the table sat the smallest bird Scrooge had ever seen. Surely they have more food than that, he whispered. Then the small boy hobbled into the room on a crutch. His name was Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim looked at the meal on the table. We must thank Mr. Scrooge, he exclaimed. Scrooge turned around and asked about Tiny Tim, but then the ghost was gone. He was alone in a graveyard suddenly. He saw a dark figure. Are you the ghost of Christmas future? Scrooge asked. The ghost was silent. He pointed to a gravestone. Scrooge saw that Cratchit's family without Tiny Tim. They were near a grave crying. The spirit pointed to an empty pit. Whose lonely grave is this? Scrooge asked. Then he realized it was his. I can change, Scrooge cried. Let me change. Suddenly, Scrooge was in his bed again. He ran to the window, looked outside. The sun was shining. The street was covered in snow. Christmas bells were ringing. It's Christmas morning, Scrooge cried. The spirits have given me another chance. He pulled on his hat and his coat and ran outside. Merry Christmas, he called to everyone he passed. He saw his nephew Fred on the street. I'm looking forward to that wonderful meal of yours, he called as he ran by. Bob Cratchit heard a loud knock on the front door. He opened to find Mr. Scrooge on a step, holding a large bag. Scrooge dumped the sack on the floor. Dozens of toys fell out. Scrooge smiled as the children rushed forward happily. Bob Cratchit, Scrooge said, I'm giving you a raise, and I'm making you my partner. Then he handed a large turkey to Mrs. Cratchit. Merry Christmas, he said happily. Merry Christmas to all, said Tiny Tim. I hope you enjoyed that one. That's always a really, really good Christmas story with a very cheerful ending. So, until we see each other again, bye-bye.